the topic which we want to present, which we want to discuss today, you have seen that from the invitations, is called regional growth poles, and what's meant by that is a model, an approach which has been practiced in the German federal land of Brandenburg. It's not exclusive to Brandenburg. It has been tried in other cases also. A model, an approach to regional economic development, growth, stimulating growth, if you so want. So this certainly will not be a lesson, a talk today about geography, statistics, history, or any of that stuff. It will focus on an approach to foster growth. Why did we choose to spend some time and some resources on this model? It's actually relatively popular. We came across this, we were reminded of this during the so-called Open Days in Brussels last year, when a representative of the OECD mentioned this as a successful example. When you look around a bit in the German language community, you will quickly come across that model and evaluation reports. It's been implemented now for a little over 10 years. Implementation and evaluation reports say that this is indeed a good and successful approach. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that Brandenburg, East Germany, large area, not overly densely populated. Okay, they have Berlin in the middle, but there's a lot of space around. And Brandenburg maybe is one of the cases which we think is more applicable to the Ukrainian case. It's always the situation in France, Portugal, it's a different context. Small countries like the Baltics, different countries. Brandenburg, East Germany, is maybe something with this historic past, central planned economy, mono industry, problems which are pretty similar to Ukraine. Still, we think it's of not much use to present just a model, just for the sake of presenting a model. That's maybe nice, but what's the added value of that? So when thinking about commissioning that study, and when ultimately inviting Frank Weltring to do that, it was very important for us as the RDPA team in ULEAD. It was very important for us to focus the attention on how did they develop this model, how did they implement, how did they communicate this, how did it work. So again, what I said earlier, don't expect too much detail about what was done in Brandenburg. We try to explain, we try to bring that message across, and we try to engage you in that discussion. We try to engage you in that discussion to understand how this was developed and how this was implemented. When saying that, I would like to give one message which some of you may be perfectly aware of, others will be easily reminded, because it's kind of no secret, and I'm telling you no news when saying that the German context is in one major thing not comparable to Ukraine. When we are presenting the model of one German Land, Bundesland, federal state, then in statistics terms, such a land is pretty well comparable to an oblast in Ukraine. So both are NUTS 2 regions, large area, approximately comparable population size, and all these statistical data. In this dimension, it is comparable. In the political administrative dimension, it's not comparable. Germany is a federation. We have elected councils, if you so want, parliaments, which have their own executive branch. So one very concrete, very technical remark, when you will hear Frank speaking, referring to ministries, he refers to ministries at the regional level, at this Länder level. Don't confuse that with the ministry at the central, at the federal government. It's, as I said, it's nothing new. It's no secret, but it's very helpful to remind this to better understand what this is all about. By having said this, yes, Frank, I have referred to our expert already a couple of times, Frank Weltring. He will say a little more about himself later. He knows that much better. We have invited him, we have involved him as an expert who was recommended to us because of the presence of himself and the company where he's mostly working in Germany. So they are, the company and Frank have experience in working in international development contexts, but they also work strongly in Germany. So we thought this is kind of the ideal setup to explain a German model. We have an expert who is a native German speaker, so he can do these interviews, which he did to actually inquire about the details which you don't find in the reports. Yeah, and we are pretty happy with the result. That's why we thought it's definitely worthwhile to organize this presentation. Frank, as I said, can say a little more about himself. He knows that better. And at the end of my short introduction speak, I would like to send a hello to a very, very important part of our audience today. As much as we are grateful for you to come here, I would like to also inform you that our audience today is much larger, because we have established a WebEx connection to the oblast, to the regions, and I don't know how many people are listening us now, but it was important for us that people working in oblast administrations, oblast councils, RDAs, that they also have the chance to listen to the presentation, not only reading the report or watching a video. It's helpful, but it's always better to see that live communication. And colleagues in the regions, I hope first technically it works and you can hear us. You will have the chance to ask your questions. We would like to encourage you to text them, to send them using that WebEx connection. We will then translate them here and through me or directly through Frank, so that we avoid switching the video connection back and forth, which may be a bit troublesome purely from a technical viewpoint. So you are very much encouraged to contribute to the discussion, ask your questions, send your questions, and we will make sure that you can hear and see as much as possible. With this, I would like to give the word to Frank. Thank you very much for coming, and wish us all an interesting 1.5 hours. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Frank Weltring. And it's a pleasure for me to be here, back in Kiev. I was here, I think the last time, something like 10 years ago, and I really looked forward to come back. Some words about myself. I'm working for a company. Oh, sorry, I also would like to say hello to these colleagues. Yeah, I think. Thank you for waving the hand. Yes, just some words about myself and our company. Yes, again, back to us. We are promoting local economic development, and let's say we always say also local innovation in localities, in cities and in regions. And that is our, let's say, our main task, our main area where we are working in. And what we always realize is that local economic development has a lot to do with the people with whom you work on the ground. Everybody knows that. But it has also to do with this coordination and cooperation between the different levels. You can have a very dynamic local community, but that is also very much depending on the support which comes, let's say, from above. And what I would like to do now is to present you this case of Brandenburg, which we call the regional growth pole approach, which has tried now in the last 14 years to combine this logic of really promoting in a creative and, let's say, encouraging way, local economic development, so the development of cities, but at the same time making sure that the ministries are not working in an isolated way. And I think that is an example because it takes very seriously the experiences from the past. So this federal state, Brandenburg, went through a process of learning So of 10 years of learning where they try different things, and 5 years of again experimenting a little bit, but then taking this regional growth pool approach and promoting it and always adjusting it again. So it's to a certain extent, it's an approach which is based on experiences, where you make failures, where you try things out, where you have to experiment, but at the same time, you use these experiments and you take them serious after a while, and you look back and say, look, maybe we have to correct something. Maybe we have to do something different. Yeah? So that is, I think, one of the most important elements of this regional growth pool approach is it is very much based on its historical path. And I would like to demonstrate you, also lead you now in this presentation through this kind of different development steps before I go a little bit more into detail in presenting you what the regional growth pool approach really entails. What I would like to lead you through is to present you briefly the Brandenburg region, or the Brandenburg federal state, giving you a first idea about what the regional growth pool is. We will come then back to it later. I would like to present you let's say the past, why the regional growth pool came up, especially looking into the 1990s and into the beginning of the 2000s. Then presenting you the key features or the key elements of the regional growth pools. We often talk about principles. What are the key principles of this approach? Because we think that principles are elements which you can transfer also to other countries. But you cannot blueprint an experience from one region to another. Yeah? I think that is an element, and I would like to point out these issues. And I would like to lead you through this development approach where Brandenburg in the 1990s started very much with a top-down approach. Then in the beginning of 2000, they started to include bottom-up elements. And the regional growth pool is, to a certain extent, we say it's a kind of mixture between an intelligent top-down approach and a very much encouraging bottom-up approach. And that's what I would like to present you. Maybe we can have a look into the place. So this is Germany. And you see that Brandenburg is in the east of Germany, very close, directly at the border of Poland. And this white element, this white island, is a very famous city. It's Berlin. So Berlin is a city-state, but at the same time, it's in the center of Brandenburg. So, and it's to a certain extent also a development driver of at least of the higher region here, of this area. So when I read about Ukraine again, for me it was a little bit like Kiev. It's a kind of development center, and you find a lot of development around it. But then the question is, what is going on in the other regions, in the other districts? So, and Brandenburg has 2.5 million inhabitants, so it's much smaller. You cannot compare it with Ukraine, but it's just like Matthias already said, it's one of the 16 federal states in Germany. You see them here, all the ones. And these ones are the 6 East German states, which were, after the reunification in Germany in 1990, they were part again of Germany, but they still suffer a lot of, let's say, economic development issues in regard to employment or unemployment, in regard to really setting new institutional structures. And Brandenburg is one of the, let's say, quite dynamic regions or dynamic federal states in this East German area. And you've got it's a size of 29,000 square kilometers, very small in comparison to Ukraine again. But the logic is here that you have got the whole federal state is again subdivided by 14 districts. And here you see the districts, and here you see the regional development poles. All the red parts which you see here are the development poles or the cities. It's partly cities, partly a merger of 2 or 3 cities, where the state Brandenburg now is focusing its development. It's focusing its economic development. that is, I think, an element which I will come through to. But what is important is, I think, is to understand that it doesn't work here. Sorry, we tried it. And it breaks always again. What is important is that this whole federal state has got different development poles. So I talked already about Berlin. That's a very dynamic area. But we have got here in the Lausitz regions, maybe you have heard about it, it's lignite mining. It was one of the centers of the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, with lignite mining and also producing different kinds of chemicals and plastics out of the lignite. And so this is nowadays an area where we face special support from the national government, because the structural change is so strong here with this lignite mining past, where you have got a special program for support. And then you've got quite tourism areas here up above Berlin, so with also again very different kinds of economic structures. But what is important to know is that this Brandenburg was in the past, in the German Democratic Republic, it was very much dominated by, let's say, monopolistic sectors, so state-planned sectors. That's in other East German states, it's a little bit different. There you looked more at local potentials. But here you had this steel production, you had the lignite mining, you had plastics production, you had optics production, but very much with a state-planned approach from the past. And that was also an issue for Brandenburg after the reunification. What do you do with these, let's say, sectors, which are less so based on really local potentials, but rather based on a planning orientation? No? That is an element I think we have to consider when we talk about Brandenburg. So when it comes to the regional growth pole, I think what is important is to know is that this one was really a change of a policy agenda. So in 2005, this regional growth pole can also be seen as a new kind of, let's say, special planning, maybe not special planning, but special economic development approach. And we talked a lot in Germany about what is the role of the government, but in this approach, you have got a very strong role of the government where they take an effort to set certain priorities. So that was an important element, and it was a change from a top-down to a bottom-up approach. And it was a very strong effort to concentrate resources, so financial support resources, to certain areas in the region. And that, I think, is important. You see here some elements which I will not go through all of them. You can see them in the presentation or in the paper also. But what comes strongly out here is that the focus was on strengthening the strengths, strengthening where you find potentials and where local potentials are. Yeah? So a very different approach than the former approach, where you have a very much, let's say, from the German Democratic Republic, a very strong state influence. Here you look at the strengths from the local potentials, and you look very strongly at economic indicators, the competitiveness of the sectors which are on the ground, the employment intensity of these sectors, and finally also what is this future development potential of these economic areas. Can we just find a way to because otherwise I cannot talk and do we have any way of
Continue, I will do another one.
Yeah? Okay. That will not be nice. Destroy this one. So what I wanted to emphasize is that this approach was developed by a kind of historical past. It came out of a lot of experiences. And like I said already, Brandenburg was strongly, let's say, influenced by these mono industries. very strong concentration of inhabitants around Berlin, and also very strongly based on heavy industries from the past. What came up after the reunification was a total change of the economic and political structure. So in all of the federal states of East Germany, you had to set up new planning structures, you had to set up new institutions, you had to set up also, let's say, new support structures for economic development. And that was quite heavy loaded. It was interesting when we talk with colleagues who are working on the ground, they all say it was an experiment. Everything what we did was an experiment because there was no model which you could follow. You were very strongly forced to see what works and what doesn't work. I think that is an element which is important to consider. So what was done in the 1990s was strongly development focused on development of infrastructure. So a new development of the whole infrastructure which was there. So here we are talking about infrastructure which was related to physical infrastructure. That means roads. It means roads across the country to the of the federal state, but also to the other regions. Okay. And it was also about institutional infrastructure. So you had to set up new economic development agencies. You had to set up new district governments. You had to set up new combinations of districts. Because what I heard now is also that in Ukraine, you're thinking about joining certain cities and merging certain cities. But with that structure, you also have to, wow. Does that work? Does that work? Can you hear me? Hello? Ah, wonderful. Good. Okay, I'm more relaxed now because I've got only two arms. So it was quite a challenge for this whole region to set up all these new structures. And that was very much the dominant task in the 1990s, to think about how can we make sure that from a planning perspective, we have got all the roads again connected. We have got institutions in place which work. And it was, to a certain extent, I would put it in parentheses, relatively easy in comparison to other countries, because in East Germany you were able to build on the structures from West Germany. So you took over a lot of structures, institutional structures from the west of Germany, and even a lot of personal people came then from West Germany to East Germany. But what they had to realize is you cannot just copy something from the west to the east. You really have to go through your own learning process. So that is, I think, a phrase which is also mentioned here. We really had to experiment. Although we saw some structures which work in the west of Germany, we had to find our own way and our own process. I would like to point out some issues which were done in the 1990s. I don't want to go through all of them. I think you find a lot of information additionally in the paper. But I don't want to go too much into detail, but pointing out some of the elements, what was done in the 1990s. So the belief was now, how can we promote economic development apart from setting up the structures? And one of the aspects was privatization. I'm sure that you also went through a process of privatization of former state-owned companies. It was also a kind of a structure where you dismantled some companies and where you try to find private investors. It was a strong effort which was done. Another one was trying to attract new investors into the region, which was a challenge because 5 federal states were somehow competing for investors at that time, because it was somehow a desperate situation. We had a high unemployment. So privatization was an element, trying to get new investors into the place, competing with all the others. So it was not very successful, but the other one was trying to build up new business models. So the government supported strongly, let's say, quite capital-intensive projects. So there were some projects where optics companies were very strongly supported to redevelop the sector again. Even in the steel production, there was support. In chemics, in plastic production. So a lot of, let's say, support from the government to make sure that somehow a basis of the old economic structure could survive. Because to a certain extent it was also a situation where we had increasing unemployment and an increasing migration from Brandenburg and other federal states of the East to the West, but also abroad. I think that was a situation where you tried to come up with some activities. And it was very strongly the idea that you can build on at least some of the left economic development poles from the past and to restructure them. So that was one of the key approaches in the 1990s to make sure very strongly from a top-down perspective that we keep some of the main sectors which have got still potentials to survive, to support them through privatization, but also trying to get new investors. And I would like to do a drawing with you on that logic of the 1990s, which goes a little bit like this. We have got different kinds of ministries here. And what was done in the 1990s was strongly that, for example, the Ministry for Construction, they developed all the generic infrastructure. So places were connected again, roads were renovated, new roads were developed which were not connected anymore before. So very strongly on generic infrastructure development. So then we have got the Ministry of Education and also Research. They strengthened certain university in the larger cities of the place. So they did a lot of activities also to strengthen institutions, and especially institutions which you need for economic development, like research and applied research. And the Ministry of Economy, they strongly put this effort on, let's say, privatization of certain industries, but at the same time also trying to get new investors into place and trying to support new big businesses which are coming into the region. That was the logic. And finally, we also have some ministries of education which also supported schools, the whole elements of planning, somehow making sure that you have got schools and certain organizations into the different places. And setting up also planning structures. So that was the logic where the different ministries supported very much, I would say, in an isolated way, different kinds of development activities. And when you see it now from the 1990s perspective, I think one element was very strongly was really the topic on rescuing and top-down policies. You try to rescue what you have, and you try to set up in parallel new structures in the place. That was the 1990 issue. It was focusing on generic infrastructure. So the generic infrastructure we talked about. It was support to everybody. So it was not focusing on certain areas. Let's say all the support which went into also streets and institutional structures were supported all over the place. So there was no focus on that. So setting certain prerequisites was an issue here. And there was a strong lack of coordination at that time. So every ministry was very busy with working on their own responsibilities. And the focus on local economic development, really looking at what is going on the ground, was very weak. So it was rather looking at what can we do from a federal state perspective, where can we rescue something, instead of looking at what is going on really in the regions apart from the heavy and old industries. I think that is another important element. And actually, I would say there was a lack of development of local environment, development of the local circumstances, improving the municipalities' responsibility, their capabilities of analyzing new emerging economic sectors. Does that make sense to you, is it? Yeah? Okay. So then, yes.
I just worked there. Maybe I may add something.
We need to speak in the microphone so that others can hear.
My name is Alexander Markus. I was colleague of Brandenburg Development Agency. I worked with the Berlin agency, development agency, Berlin partner. All what you tell is very true. The main focus, what the politics at that period said, we need pilot projects. They were all speaking about chips in Frankfurt Oder or air transport, these huge ships and pilot projects, investment into pilot projects.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, thank you. Very good point. So this idea was not also to say, like, we just support something. There was the idea of setting somehow examples. And based on these examples, multiplicating these examples. That was very strongly the logic. And also with a let's say, with a focus on investment. It was not that they just looked for every investment. It was also looking at where are local potentials from the perspective of past skills, and whom can we attract to our place. Yeah. Okay, but I think what is important for me, it was still done very much from a top-down perspective. And it was also, at that time, it was rational to do that, because it was important to, first of all, get the structures right again, and getting, let's say, a kind of generic infrastructure done. But in the beginning of 2000, then the question was, what can we do now? Looking at the heavy industries, which were partly able to survive, but some of these pilot projects broke down. The new investments were relatively not so strong than expected, and the question was, what can we do? And in the beginning of the 2000s, the government started to look at what are the local competence fields, what are the local clusters, what we often say, where in these regions are local economic development opportunities on certain, let's say, certain competitive advantages, which are also related to maybe some universities which are there. Yeah? And on that basis, the logic was then to say, look, let's have a look more into local opportunities. What are new local emerging sectors coming up? And based on that, there was a development of 67 clusters or 67 competence fields, with also linking that to certain locations. So what was done then was really to say, we are now looking at certain clusters. So there is steel, here there is lignite mining, but especially around lignite mining, there is some strong machine building sectors. And so you looked at different kinds of clusters, linked that to cities and to, let's say, local areas. And based on that, this analysis, you see that, I think you see that here now, it was strongly, what's this one now?
It's still 90s.
Yeah, here we are in the 2000s. So it was this 26 cities where you looked at, moving from a rather cluster approach and then saying from these different kinds of competence fields in 67 areas, we have to think now about how can we concentrate our forces. Because we cannot work in 67 places on a lot of competences. So where can we focus with the most important, let's say, impact? That was very strongly the move towards the regional growth poles. And you see here that then afterwards in 2005, there was a lot of analysis done by identifying these potentials, these economic local potentials. And then by 2005, it was decided we have to focus. It was also because of financial limitations. It was not only about the question of promoting economic development. There was also, let's say, a public factor of limitations of funds. So where can we focus it with the highest impact? And that's what was done then in 2005, looking at these 26 cities with a regional growth pole approach. very strongly identifying a focus on the activities which you are doing and going much more local, going much more bottom up, but linking that with a top-down approach, which is very much related to a coordination with the local regional growth pools. And I would like to have a look into this one now. Here you see again the drawing which we had. The regional growth pools was again very much focusing on competitiveness. How can we not so much look at strategic planning processes, but how can we promote economic development in these cities? And how can we encourage the city responsible persons, but also the private sector, to get involved in this process? And in the paper again, you find a lot of elements which have been supported, but I would like to point out only some of them. But first, have a look at these regional growth pools. You see that they are quite separated in the federal state, but at the same time, you can also realize that most of them were medium-sized cities or larger cities before. So there is a certain parallel structure also towards the size of the cities. But at the same time, you see that there is a difference in the size itself again. So you see that there are 3 regional growth poles, or 3 cities between 20 to 30,000 inhabitants, 5 between 30 to 50,000, 4 between 50 to 80,000, and 3 over 80,000. And it was about 10 single cities, and it was 5 cities where you cooperated between 2 or 3 municipalities. That is the regional growth pole separation, let's say. No? And I would like to say some words about this selection. So the question was, how do you justify a political change from a rather, let's say, generic approach where you support everybody on a competitive basis, where you can apply for funds, and then changing that and to a certain extent providing special support for some of the regions. And that was very much based on the past experience, but it was also based on the data which was provided from the development trends. And there were some criteria which were used for selecting regional growth pools. And one of the criteria was that there was a kind of average economic and scientific potential. So there was the need to have also some research in this place, some universities. And some of these cities came together because the one city had some universities, the others not. So these, let's say, the growth pools with the 5 growth pools with a mixture of cities, they were very much also often related to linking university research and business potential. So, then there was the need of having these clusters, the competence fields, which are to a certain extent in this place, which are, let's say, creating synergies also between others. And it was a criteria that it was a minimum size of 20,000 inhabitants per regional growth pool. And I would like to point out some features which I think are relevant and very important. What was necessary for each of these municipalities was to develop a regional or local economic development strategy. So every location, every municipality had to develop with the private sector, had to develop a strategy how to promote their competitiveness of their sectors. And they had to also provide certain examples of business activities, programs or projects, how to do that. So it was quite a strong emphasis from one moment to the other also to provide support or to provide responsibility to the municipalities, and also with some indications that you had to bring in the private sector into this process. Then another important element was that the importance of this had the highest level. So the state chancellery of the federal government, they coordinated this whole process. So it was a strong policy, let's say, perspective also on that. It was clear that the state chancellery, the highest level at the federal state, was taking over a certain coordination role. And there was, what is, I think, interesting, also even for Germany, was that there was a new structure put in, very strongly a kind of coordination between the ministries and also between the ministry and the ministries and the local cities. And I would like to emphasize this again on the drawing. When you see that drawing now, you see that here we had the situation that every ministry was very strongly supporting their own responsibilities. What came in with a regional growth pole, but there was a role of coordination between these ministries. So interministerial working group was founded, which means that all the regions, now when we take these ones as regional growth poles, yeah, all these regional growth poles had direct access to this interministerial working group. And that was a setting where different representatives of the ministries were coming together and where the regional growth poles had the chance to demonstrate their project proposals based on the strategy which they developed. And they were able to, once a year, coming into this interministerial working group, where the ministries, with their planned activities in the regions, had to coordinate with the different regional growth poles. And that was a strong kind of, I would say, vertical coordination between the ministry working group and the regional growth poles. And there was a strong, let's say, horizontal coordination between these ministries to make more successful use of the funds. That was an important element in that respect. Yes, I would like to look at this kind of small drawing, which I find very important in that respect. When you look at this coordination element, you have got these different ministries. And in these ministries, in the past, it was strongly that everybody was doing their own work. That means that everybody was supporting to a certain extent their responsibility areas. But then now with this logic of this interministerial coordination and the working group, it was this idea that you create a coordination function from which you start to coordinate what is done in the regional growth poles. And the regional growth poles are these ones. So the idea was strongly having a coordination between you and also strongly a coordination downwards. That was one of the key success factors of the regional growth pole approach. From a multi-governance perspective level, I think. Yeah. Where is my presentation? Then there is another element, I think, which we have to consider is the financial support. So what was done in the past individually from the ministries into the regions, it was now focused. So the regional growth poles had access to specific funds, but they also had access to funds which are available for every location, but with a higher percentage of subsidies. So for one regional growth pole, if you were, for example, a city like Cottbus, and you had a plan, you had your strategy developed, it was possible that you designed your activities, let's say the projects which you wanted to realize, and then you have got the coordination with the ministry, with this ministerial working group, and then these different ministries looked at how can we support you in different ways in a joint manner instead of looking only at the different funding streams from each ministry. I think that was one of the key success factors of the regional growth poles because they were able, with own participation of costs also, but they were able to realize their projects which they planned in the regional economic development strategies based on the coordination with the ministries and with the funding streams which came in. And that was, I think, the financial element was important to see also. But more important was rather this coordination element, having this communication access to the ministries. Just asking myself now where I am here. What is it saying up there, if I may ask?
Instruments of regional growth pools, critical factors, number 5. Critical success factors 5.
Okay. Critical success is 5. Okay, yeah. So here you see a kind of merger between this different elements which were somehow coming together from a top-down approach and from a bottom-up approach. And what was one of the, I would say, one of the key elements was that you really looked at what are the advantages, the economic advantages at the locations. What are then the financial support elements which you put together? And one of the other important elements was to say how we are supporting now municipalities in the long process. The regional growth pool was very strongly emphasizing 5 years at the first stage. So municipalities were not, it was not necessary for them now to write every proposal and compete with other localities. But the idea was strongly, we provide you with a long-term support, but you have to develop your own activities. And you play a strong role in defining the priorities. But if you come up with project ideas, we have to coordinate that with the interministerial working group. And if the interministerial working group, from a top-down perspective, says it's a good way, it fits with your competence areas and with your strategy, then we can support you. Yeah? That is a strong element, I think, what is important to consider here. And this is number 3. Can you say the first one? Institutional. What does this say here? Institutional? Assuring.
Independent.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, what I would like to point out is this economic potential. I emphasize this. But one element was it was a strong change of mindset. So the local organizations were responsible from one moment to the other in that respect of taking over responsibility. And I think what is important in that respect is to say they really started to promote the local economic development, the local economic environment. So when we look at the overall approach, the RGP, when you see it here as flowers, in the past, in the 1990s, they tried to promote certain sectors from a top-down manner. They supported privatization, they supported big development projects, but now with a regional economic development approach, the idea was strongly to say, how can we support really, from a flower perspective, the development perspective, how can we set the framework, how can we promote local economic development and setting the environment right, priorities, with a top-down approach. So we are supporting you with this interministerial working group and with some support, but you yourself have to develop the structures, and only you can also identify what are the local competitive potentials of your location. So I tried to point out what are some of the main issues of this regional growth pole element. Strongly bottom-up, strongly supported by the government, but not in a, let's say, top-down manner, rather in a communication-based manner, with finally quite a lot of success with some adjustments every 5 years, but with the idea that in a place where you have got not so much experience with local economic development and you have to set up structures, you need to put responsibilities into the hands on the ground, because otherwise there is no capacity building, and local capabilities for economic developments are essential to develop, because otherwise you stay with a top-down approach in that respect. So this is, let's say, in a nutshell, the regional growth pool approach. And we have in the paper also reflected about what are transferable issues which we have to which we can discuss. And is the approach an approach which is useful also for Ukraine? What we say is always you cannot copy an approach, but maybe there are some elements which are relevant, which are really focusing also to bring in the economic development aspect stronger, with a stronger bottom-up perspective. And we have mentioned some of these elements here in the presentation also. So one issue is to promote local economic development strategies, really with the private sector. That was, at least in Brandenburg, quite a big change to strengthen also responsibilities on the ground and to strengthen really private and public sector communication. This element of improving the horizontal and the vertical coordination sounds to me it's a very interesting example to look how can we improve the coordination between the ministries, but also how can certain regional areas and cities with a strong potential get more focus, more attention from the government. Clear prioritization of development efforts. So there was a walking away from helping everybody, but rather supporting the ones where you really see an opportunity of improvement of economic development. That doesn't mean that others were totally left out. That's not the truth. But the focus was strongly about taking the ones and choosing the ones with whom you see a potential also to develop not only the city, but also the region around it. It was important to let go from strategic planning perspectives. The 1990s was very strongly on focusing on strategic planning, and there it was obvious that the economic development was not so much touched by that. You can set up a lot of institutions, and you can have planning structures, and you can set up also generic infrastructure. But if it comes towards economic development, you really have to identify also economic criteria for development. And these economic criteria and the economic potentials you mainly can identify at the local level. You cannot watch from the helicopter perspective onto the cities and onto the regions and then saying what has to be done. It has a lot to do with motivated stakeholders. It has a lot to do with also the potentials which you do not see from the helicopter perspective. And the one important element which I tried to demonstrate with this drawing was the element of really coordination between the municipalities. Partly, some of these municipalities had to coordinate with each other because they were in one regional growth pools, but also horizontal coordination between the cities and the private sector at the local level, between the city administration and the organizations which were there on the ground, NGOs, but also economic development agencies. And finally, also this coordination between the regional the cities and the interministerial working group. And for us, this example is an example where you try to, in a federal state or in a place where you have got a lot of experience with top-down development, it's an experience of how to promote in parallel bottom-up structure, handing over responsibilities to the cities, and at the same time trying to, not leaving them alone and saying, look, bottom-up and you can do it all yourself, but trying to create communication structures and channels which help you to, on the one hand, strengthen the local potentials and the local stakeholders, but at the same time also doing some coordination with certain financial instruments but at the same time also through joining forces at the ministerial level, which we often find even in Germany also in an isolated way. Yeah? And then you lose all the synergies. And this, I think this element is an important element, even for Germany with the regional growth poles. It became an example in the European Union, but it's very strongly finally also an issue about how do you steer regional development in a place which has not so much experiences with it, and how do you build up this experience, making sure that you get the economic development as a priority. It was a lot of words.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Do you hear me now? Yes. Thank you, Frank. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you also for sticking more or less to the timeline, which means that we have, as we had planned, that we have about 40 minutes left for indeed question and answers. And you remember when we started, I made sure to pay special attention to our participants in the regions. And I'm actually pretty happy that first the system which we have set up works, but even more that people who are listening, who are following us in the regions are indeed asking questions. That's why I take the liberty of the moderator's microphone to indeed give the first couple of questions to the people from the regions. And one question which has reached us, as the radio moderator now would say, is probably not a surprising one. I was actually expecting this, and I think it might be a good one to start with, Frank. The question from the regions is, can you please compare the two approaches, smart specialization and regional growth poles? We discussed that in the preparation of this, we discussed that a bit, so Frank knows about kind of the role which smart specialization currently plays here in Ukraine. That's why I don't think need to explain much. So the question is straightforward. Can you please compare these two? And the second question, which is related to that, you mentioned universities and research institutes. What was their role in that process, or what is their role in that process?
Okay, first the smart specialization versus the regional growth poles. The regional growth pole approach is very strongly focusing, first of all, on the city development with economic sectors. So you look at certain cities where you think that there is potential, and you focus very strongly on what is there and what are economic opportunities. The smart specialization, from my perspective and from my understanding, is very strongly focusing on innovation promotion and looking at what are synergies between different sectors, and how can we promote from a policy perspective, moving from a cluster approach towards more a specialization between different synergies between different sectors. And that is, for me, a more specific, more specialized approach on focusing on very strong on innovation and cross-innovation. I mean, we discussed about it. But that is my perspective on smart specialization, where you really look at how can you, because of smart, how can you promote new innovation perspectives or bring new innovation perspectives through crossing different kinds of business sectors. And the regional growth pole is very strongly looking, first of all, at the city and looking at and the place. It's very much a more place-based approach, I would say, a little bit more than a smart specialization perspective. And it looks at what you have there at the moment and how can you promote that. This cross-innovation element is not so strongly now an element, especially it's interesting in Brandenburg now, this comes up now. Smart specialization programs are coming into Brandenburg, but the Brandenburg government says itself, we are not yet ready for that. We are not yet at that point where we say, look, we want to do a lot of cross-innovation promotion. Yeah?
But the second part of the question, the role of universities and research institutes in the growth poles?
Yeah, the role is playing a very important role. I mean, I said already that one of the criteria is that you have got scientific potentials. that you really bring in universities into the research. So you find in all of these regional growth pools, you have got at least one university which is linked directly as a stakeholder also in this regional growth pool, as a member of this of the representative of this regional growth pool, is taking part. And there are a lot of research programs which are especially, you have to have in your strategy, you have to have research projects, applied research projects where you integrate the universities, and normally the universities have also to do kind of monitoring in the sense of bringing in their own opinion about where new knowledge has to brought in more intensively.
So maybe one question from this room before I will refer to the next question, which we already have from the regions, but maybe there's one urgent question. Tatiana?
Дякую. Скажіть, будь ласка,
What happened to the municipalities which did not become regional growth poles?
It's a very good question, because there were some opposition on this issue, because it's for sure every municipality which was not selected as a regional growth pole was at the same time having fear of not getting any access to financial support anymore. We had a lot of reflection on this question of what happened, and I think I would say there are three elements which were important so that they were, let's say, not starting in a revolution. And there was one issue was that the funding programs which we have in Brandenburg, they were still there. So we have got 28 funding programs to a certain extent which were still accessible to a far extent for those other municipalities, but they were not supported from a subsidy level that high. That was one element, and they had not access to this interministerial working group, which was, I think, is essential for this approach. That is one issue. The other issue is that it was a clear political decision, so it was based on being able to demonstrating data-wise what the support activities in the 1990s had as an impact. And it was obvious that this, we call it watering can principle. You try to support everybody, that did not work out and did not meet the expectations which were there. And that was based on data. You were able to demonstrate that to the municipalities. Look, the development which you had in the last 10 years, was not very successful. And that at least one of the ministerial representatives said that made some municipalities a little bit more silent in their way of opposing this approach. And I think the third element is it was really, to a certain extent, a top-down decision. It was based on experiences in the 10 years before. What were the places where a dynamic development happened? And it was, to a certain extent, a political decision in the sense to say, we have to prioritize. We have got not anymore the finance which we had in the beginning. So this is a political decision, and we stand for that. And it was politically, from a voting system, also supported finally by the voters, which were then again supporting this government. Does that make sense?
I have three questions here from the regions, which I would like to group in one, and probably they also include some sort of feedback to your presentation, Frank, which you may want to explain a little more on a certain aspect. The questions all focus around or on projects. So the question is, please provide example of a good project which was funded and which was aimed at developing a specific growth pole, and an example of a failed one. Another question, which key performance indicators were used to identify projects worth supporting? So from my reading of these questions, you may want to explain again a little more what the difference is between a project and a growth pole. Yeah, and then coming back to these indicators, how to identify what you just explained.
Yeah. So the regional growth pole is a selection of the place. either a city or a merger or agglomeration of maximum 3 cities. And they had to develop a regional economic development strategy. They had to develop that not on their own basis from a municipality point of view, but they had to integrate the private sector. They had to integrate the research and development organizations. And based on that, they had to develop a plan, not a plan, a strategy, I would say, a vivid strategy, because that had to be renewed every 3 years. And within this strategy, you did an analysis of strengths and weaknesses, but finally you came up with certain measures or projects. And these projects were then presented as, let's say, dynamic factors for the further development of the strengths which you have in that location. So the projects then had to be coordinated with the interministerial working group. And based on this interministerial working group, the question was what kind of funding streams can be used and be also, to a certain extent, merged from the different ministerial activities. So here now you see a graphic which demonstrates an overview about the project priorities which the different growth poles had altogether from 2005 to 2018. And you see a strong dominance in infrastructure development. But here when we talk about infrastructure development, we do not talk about the generic infrastructure which was so much supported in the 1990s. Here we talk about business infrastructure. We talk about development of technology parks. We develop the development of
Logistic parks.
Sorry?
Logistic parks.
Logistic parks. Yeah, there was a lot of examples. But it's also about streets, which have to do with certain business estates, with development of industrial estates. You see, the second one I think is the industrial states, where you develop industrial areas.
Industrial parks.
Industrial parks. How do we call them in Germany?
Gewerbeflächen.
Gewerbeflächen, genau, Gewerbeparks.
Yeah. And then there was a question on the indicators. It was interesting. In the process of the regional growth poles, the indicators became more, because in the beginning it was very strongly focusing on infrastructure, on business infrastructure, on municipal infrastructure. And in the process, after the first evaluation of this whole approach, it was stronger focusing on innovation. How do you promote in your strategy innovation-oriented sectors? How do you bring in innovation into the area? How do you make sure that you also encourage new development, new economic development? So it means start-up promotion. And you see that in this process, the lower you go, the more these other indicators come in, where it comes towards innovation perspectives. And I think it's now, in 2018, there was another evaluation where they say now, look, this business infrastructure is always an issue. Every economic sector and every economic location has to adjust all the time. And now we talk about digitalization, and we talk about smart development and smart specialization, where you also have to develop the infrastructure at the local level in a new way. So that will continue to be an issue, but what is important is coming in here that they also have to bring in new innovation elements. And these criteria are becoming stronger now in the new setup of the regional growth pole, let's say, system. There was a question of one example, one good example, and one weak example. I cannot say so strongly now what is one weak example, but what was clear after the first evaluation was that there was a lot of infrastructure development done, which was not so much oriented towards the businesses. So it was, the municipality said, okay, we can get some funds to create our roads, but what is a real economic element in that? What is the economic advantages in that? And it was also the question, sometimes some technology parks were created. The question was then, what is the real demand? How can we get these projects, these technology parks filled with businesses which might not be there yet? And then the question is, what do you develop first, the infrastructure and the building, or do you first develop the sectors and then you build it on a demand-based approach? You then create maybe a small center which can grow then after a while. So I think there was a lot of learnings on this infrastructure issue. And I think what are very good examples, you find the same good examples where you have got technology parks. We have got in Potsdam, for example, very close to Berlin, quite some sectors which became now quite world-class sectors. So Potsdam is very famous for filming, for the filming industry, which was strongly supported by this region across the world. So there are some business areas where really you see a growth through the specific support.
Another question from this room.
Yeah, I have a question related to the selection of the growth poles. So, how much time did you need to select these growth poles? And are there any methodology that you applied? And who was in charge for this whole process?
Sorry, say it again.
Okay. Okay. The question was related to the selections of the growth poles. So how much time did you need to select them? And are there any methodology which you applied? And who was in charge for this whole process? Who defined these benchmarks? Who defined statistics which has to be met?
So the benchmarks were defined by the Ministry of Economy in cooperation with the Czech State Chancellery. So it was to a certain extent a top-down decision made. It was a decision made which was, I tried to point out which was made on the competence fields, which you identified as the locations, but it was also based on the experiences in the last 10 years beforehand of dynamic places where a lot of activities were already supported, and where you saw that project proposals were written and activities were going on. But I think I mentioned the three criteria, this research element with the number of inhabitants. But it was finally also decided to say, where do you find agglomeration zones which have got maybe a synergy to the surrounding area? And you cannot, like you see maybe if you look at the growth poles themselves, you see that they are distributed to a certain extent in the whole federal state. But it was also the idea to say, look, we cannot only look now into this area, we also have to consider the others. It was a mixture between the indicators were important, but it was also to say, how can we make sure that this whole the region, which is directly at the border of Poland, is not totally left out? Where is in this area a development pole? Is it here, or is it here, or is it here? So we have to make sure that we also develop in a certain way and balance.
Yeah. How much time did you use for it to define this growth pole?
I cannot tell you very clearly about it, I must admit. I know that in 2000 there was a step-by-step approach. This cluster competence identification was a strong element in 2000, the beginning of 2000. And then it came very clearly that it was a process of, I think it was based on this experience of we have a lack of funds, where can we focus? A whole discussion of something like 2 years, but the decision finally was made actually in 2005.
The question from the regions, two questions which I think are pretty much related, they concern the relation between the government and the private sector. So the question is, RGP's result from business growth, I'm not quite sure. How was the government able to support businesses? The question continues asking how to avoid corruption in that. My personal experience, that may not be such an urgent issue in Germany, but if you have any other or any concrete examples, feel free. The second questions in that regard, usually the private sector works separately from the government. So what were the common points of cooperation in Brandenburg?
I'm talking now about the cooperation between the economic sector, or the private sector, and the government in the regional growth pool approach. Because I showed you that in the beginning, in the 1990s, there was a strong role also of the federal government to say which sectors and which businesses can we support, especially heavy industry businesses, which we can support so that they survive, they maybe get competitive again in the longer run. But when it comes to the regional growth pools, this whole communication with the private sector was very much decentralized. The government, the national government, or the federal government of Brandenburg was not so much involved in these discussions with the private sector. The responsibility was now given to the municipalities and the research organizations. They had to bring in the private sector, and they had to also develop this strategy, this local development strategy with the private sector. And there it was then the cooperation going on. I mean, if you develop a technology park, if you even develop, let's say, some local sectors, more normally small and medium enterprises, you have to do that with the private sector. And that is the logic very strongly, that you are overcoming the risks that the municipality is now developing a strategic plan for themselves. They think that they know about what the private sector is doing. They had to involve them in this whole process. And they had to be even partly taking also economic, let's say they have to also be partly involved in certain payment, number of payments also for certain infrastructure development activities. The private sector. So that is this issue of the cooperation with the private sector. I think that is a very strong element. It's very important. If you develop a local economic development strategy, you cannot do that on your own. You have got not the competences to talk about the private, about economic development. You have to bring in and make use of the knowledge of the businesses which are there. The small and medium enterprises are the majority in that respect. Corruption, I think it's the corruption point of view. I would just say this interministerial working group is documented in a very detailed way. If I can find about every meeting of this interministerial working group, you can find documentation. And I do not have so much the fear that there is corruption going on. It's rather the idea there to really say, how can we coordinate our funds and our ministry responsibilities to make sure that these projects are really implemented. And there was a certain need also to justify your activity. So you cannot just come and say, look, this is a project which is very good, please give us the funds. It was very strongly based on your strategy, on the activities which you are doing at the moment, and also the plan of how you want to implement the activities. And the last thing was the cooperation. What was the...
Well, the question was, usually the private sector works separately from the government. What's the common points of cooperation?
Yes, but if you look at, you could say that at the national level it's very generic. Why should the private sector always come to meetings and big strategy planning activities? But when it comes to the local level, my experience is that the private sector normally is interested to develop the economic, let's say, surrounding of that place. And if they are not interested at the moment, then you have to think about what are the businesses interested in? What is their situation and where do you have to do something? And we often lack, that's my experience, a lack of communication with the private sector to really identify what is needed from their perspective to develop that place. And I think that was an element here very strongly. The involvement of the private sector was not to involve them in some meetings, but the idea was to really get an idea of what do the different business sectors require to increase their development. And infrastructure is one issue, but maybe knowledge is another issue, or new technologies might be a third one.
Final question from the room, from Nazari.
I have a question regarding the markets to supply the production, because while developing these regional growth, regional poles of growth, you are locating, as I understand, industrial parks and developing transport infrastructure. Do you take into account the markets to supply production that is produced inside these industrial parks? Or it depends only on local potential and scientific base?
What do you mean by markets? If you say local potentials and...
I mean, in what way do you define, in what way do you discover markets? It can be internal market, because each production should be consumed anyway, right? And as I know, Germany produces a lot of types of production. And in what way do you define the markets?
Yeah, okay. I think I think if I understand it right, and how far are the markets defined on which basis you then develop certain parks or certain economic sectors?
I'd say do markets, it can be internal market or external market, for example, export. Do markets influence on your selection of types of industry and on the location of regional poles of growth?
I mean, you always say you. I mean, I must also say that I'm not working in Brandenburg and not in the ministry or in the government. So I think that is an important element. But I think in general, when you think about future potentials of certain sectors, you take into consideration economic criteria. That means what are the markets, what are the products, where are the problems of these products in the market, because they maybe might not comply with certain standards or certain production requirements or consumer requirements. So I would say in general, the selection of economic potentials or economic sectors are always referring to what are markets there and what are opportunities to increase these sectors or these businesses based on the demand. That in every, I think, economic analysis, normally you look into also what are the potentials of the markets, and especially in Brandenburg, the East European market is a strong market, considering what is going on in Poland, but also in other East European countries in the market perspective. So it's very close to that market, and taking that into consideration. That is one issue. The other issue is that I think this whole promotion of technology parks, or let's say, I don't want to always emphasize these technology parks or these logistics parks. These are big institutional places, but there is also support to small and medium enterprises in getting a better linkage to universities and supporting really a better product, or improving their processes or improving their business models. And I think it's always then the question of a little bit supply from the government or from this regional growth pole to develop this element. So it's always a mixture of what is the demand at the moment and how can we also create some supply for development of this demand. So there's always a kind of, this activity of promoting certain businesses in certain sectors is always a kind of, also kind of supply and demand consideration.
Thank you. We have reached 3 p.m., which was the time we had set for this presentation, for this meeting. Now, if you have more questions and if people want to stay, I mean, obviously, who needs to leave is free to leave, but who wishes to stay, you're more than welcome to stay. And Stas, if you have more questions, then I think, Frank, if that's okay, to discuss some more questions.
Thank you, Frank, for this presentation. The question is like let's develop this topic about those municipalities that were not chosen as the poles of growth. Do you have some data, some comparison of, for example, in 5-year perspective of comparable municipalities, how they have developed in some economic issues and indicators, comparing to those which were chosen as the poles of growth?
Yeah, very good question. Because that question was also a big issue now in the evaluations. In each evaluation, when you do a 5-year evaluation of this approach, you have to justify why do you continue to support certain places. And what came out of this in 2018, the last evaluation was that you have a lot of cities around the pole of Berlin. They are better off than a lot of cities of regional growth poles here. And that is an issue then where you have to ask yourself, what is the reason of that? And it has a lot to do with let's say, with the dynamic around Berlin. So that cities which are around Berlin, and although they might not be centers of the regional development poles, they benefit economically from people who are moving out of the other places into the city area or into the larger regional area. That is one issue. The other issue is that you find overall, you can say that the regional growth poles are better off compared to their areas, the cities around them. You can see that they are better off, but still there is still a little bit of migration going on to this area. So it was possible to increase the economic development in every of those regional growth poles, but it didn't mean, and that was also one objective, to keep the people there. So in some places you still see that people are moving away, but with a potential also, a higher potential of new people coming in again. So there is a more fluctuation of people moving out and coming in and coming back also. So, I mean, in summary, what is now the idea in this regional growth pole is to think about maybe we have to take a little bit less focus on the surrounding areas around Berlin. And maybe we have to focus a little bit more. This is an area of lignite mining. We need maybe a special program for there because a lot of people are moving there away. But in general, the approach, looking at certain poles and also seeing that they are better off than in the surrounding areas, that will stay. Good.
One more question from the regions about the influence of politicians. Did the politicians, political parties have any role, any influence in deciding on where the regional growth poles were established?
In the past? Yeah. Okay. So politicians, I would say not. It was really very strongly a decision made based on the decision of the Ministry of Economy, providing a suggestion, and then the state chancellery saying yes. But it was not that every politician came in there and had a voice or something like that. I think that is an important element to consider, because otherwise you would run into the risk that every politician from regions or from these places which were not selected would make a lot of noise at the ministerial level. And it was clearly decided that this is a decision from the top.
I understand that more and more people want to leave, need to leave. So maybe we close this presentation and continue by sharing the Ukrainian translation of the paper and the presentation. Some have already received it. Whoever, and I'm looking again to people out there in the regions, whoever is interested, whoever has not received it yet, can definitely access that. And maybe we come back to, I'm seeing that 2 more questions have come in. Maybe we can respond to them in another way. Frank is here until tomorrow morning, so we have a few minutes left, few hours left to deal with that. With this, I would like to thank you for coming. Thank you, Frank, for preparing the study, the case study, and answering all the questions, which obviously is more difficult to respond to rather than the paper which you prepare at home and you have a chance to follow up on details. I hope that was interesting and inspirational for you, and let's see how we can follow up on that. Thank you very much for coming.